How well do vaccines work? How do we measure vaccine efficacy and effectiveness? What are some common vaccine myths? All this and more on today's episode of The Secret Life of Numbers. Welcome to the Secret Life of Numbers podcast, the podcast where we dissect everyday numbers and statistics to tell you the stories behind them.
Each episode, we take a number or statistic and break it down. We will tell you where it comes from and what it means for you. Along the way, hopefully we will inspire you to think about the numbers in your own life.
I'm Levannia, your data scientist on call. I'll be breaking down the numbers.
I'm Lindsay, your data translator, for when Levannia gets too technical on us. I'll be breaking down the rest.
Okay, let's jump in. All right, so I'm really excited about this episode because it's the second in our three-part mini-series that's really talking about vaccines. So today, we're talking about vaccine efficacy and effectiveness.
I think especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccines have really been front of mind, of course, and people are all kind of developing the language of vaccines.
Yeah.
You hear these words tossed around a lot on the media, and I think it's really important to get a grasp of, what they actually mean.
Yes, vaccine literacy.
Yes. Before we jump into the math, we wanted to take a minute just to talk about how vaccines are developed, because one thing I heard a lot from people who are maybe a little more unsure about the COVID-19 vaccine was that they were nervous about how quickly it was developed. The thing about the COVID-19 vaccine, vaccines really, is it's one of those situations where you see what humanity is capable of when you throw all the money in the world and all of the world's brightest minds at a problem. We could do that probably for other diseases and vaccines, but never has it been so urgent.
Yes. And the work so targeted. I feel like everyone shifted almost to have some form of pandemic research in their work.
Yeah, and even people who weren't working on vaccines, the research became about what's the effect of COVID-19 on XYZ.
Mm-hmm. For 2 years, 2 years or longer now. It's been a while, guys. But for this period of time, our lives have, in a sense, been centered around what's going on with the pandemic. What do I need to know today? What are the rules around masking and vaccines? How do I travel?
Yeah, and it's kind of led to a broader interest, I think, in just vaccines in general.
Mm-hmm.
And, never before, I can't say never before. I wasn't around for, I'm only 24. But never in my lifetime have we seen such a focus on vaccines. Oh, and also a note, part of what allowed us to develop the COVID-19 vaccine so quickly is the mRNA groundwork was laid with SARS.
Yes.
A decade or so. Was it 2004 that SARS?
2003.
So a lot of the groundwork was laid then because people started working on vaccine for SARS. And then the COVID-19 virus is part of the same virus family. So some of that work really helped speed up what we were doing with COVID.
Yeah, it could be translated.
But in general, vaccines, it can be a very long, expensive, and resource-intensive process to actually develop a vaccine.
I probably wouldn't want it any other way because you're trying to protect people against diseases.
No, I completely agree. We want something that is safe. We want something that's effective.
Yeah, the process is very rigorous to develop one.
There's quite a few different phases in general that vaccine development follows. And we'll just talk briefly, mostly about the clinical trials involved in it, just to give you an idea of the numbers and the rigor. There's the preclinical phase. With preclinical, it could be, testing in a cell culture, in vitro is what that's called, or it could be testing in a mouse model, and that would be in vivo because it's a live model.
And I think the Latin of those words translates to in glass for in vitro and in life for in vivo.
Yes, exactly. And then we come to clinical development. And this is the part that I think was on a lot of people's minds because this is when we actually test the vaccine in a human population. I think that can kind of sound scary without an understanding of what actually goes into reaching a point where something is ready to be tested in humans. There's different phases to what we call clinical trials for drugs. So this follows the FDA's kind of set rules for the 3 phases of clinical trials. So in phase 1, you have 20 to 100 healthy volunteers. And the questions you're asking in this phase, is this vaccine safe? Does it seem to work? Are there serious side effects? How is the dose related to side effects? In phase 2, you get more people. So you have several hundred volunteers. And you only go to phase 2 if you pass phase 1.
Yeah, I think you view them as gated, right? Like in order to get to phase 2, you have to pass through the gates of phase 1, being the pass-fail criteria of phase 1.
Yes, exactly. So in phase 2, with the several hundred people, you're asking questions more like, what are the most common short-term side effects, right? So that could be like pain at the injection site or slight fever. And you're asking, how are the volunteers' immune systems responding to the vaccine? So are they producing a good, what we call titer of antibodies, or are they producing a robust response? And then in phase 3, there's hundreds or thousands of volunteers. And what we want to know is, how do people who get the vaccine and people who do not get the vaccine compare when challenged with the disease? Is it safe? Is it effective? And again, what are the most common side effects? Because we have a bigger sample. The FDA will only license a vaccine if it's safe and effective and the benefits outweigh the risks. And even once it's licensed, there's continual monitoring of the vaccine, the manufacturing, each lot of the vaccine. That's what a batch is called. So you can think of it like a batch of cookies.
Yes.
Like each batch, they are checking to make sure that it is to the quality and standards that are required. So there's quite a process that goes into it. So after that clinical development, there's that regulatory review and approval like we talked about, and the manufacturing and quality control, of course.
And I guess this process is meant to protect the recipients of the vaccine.
Yeah, and it also provides comfort that you know that if something's approved, it's gone through these checks and balances.
Now that we know a bit about how vaccines are developed, we can get into the meat and the nitty-gritty of vaccine efficacy versus effectiveness.
I feel like they should have had 2 words that don't start with the letter E. Like, one should be something else.
I feel like we might mix them up a little bit in the episode, and we will be correcting ourselves.
Yeah, we'll do our best there.
So I guess this kind of ties back to, I think, when we spoke about sunscreen and SPF, and we were talking about efficacy versus effectiveness.
Yes, and I think this also came up in our first episode ever about 99.9% of germs, because we test that hand sanitizer in that controlled environment.
Yes.
But then you're not perfectly spreading it when you're doing your normal slapdash.
Yeah, hand sanitizer in the wild is not used as it would be in the lab.
Yes, in the wild.
And the same principle applies to vaccine efficacy and effectiveness. I'm going to give you some definitions from the WHO, which is the World Health Organization. Vaccine efficacy is measured in a controlled clinical trial and is based on how many people who got vaccinated developed the outcome of interest. If we're talking about the COVID-19 vaccine, it would be COVID-19, compared with how many people who got the placebo, which we often refer to as like a dummy vaccine. It's made to be as similar as possible to the vaccine minus the active ingredients.
It's kind of like in a pill trial. One would be like a sugar pill that looks like the pill that they're testing, but it doesn't actually have those active ingredients. So it eliminates that potential for a placebo effect.
Once the study is complete, so you've done the clinical trial where you've injected individuals with your vaccine and with the placebo, the numbers of people who developed the disease of interest is compared in both groups. And then from this, we can get efficacy. And the efficacy is a measure of how much the vaccine lowered the risk of getting sick. So if a vaccine has high efficacy, a lot fewer people in the group who receive the vaccine will get sick than the people in the group who receive the placebo.
So when they give us a number of like a vaccine has an efficacy of 80%, what is that telling us about what it does?
the vaccine efficacy is stated as 80%, that means that out of the people in the clinical trial, those who received the vaccine were at an 80% lower risk of developing the disease than the group who received the placebo.
So it doesn't mean that 20% of the people who got the vaccine get the disease.
No, that's I think a common misconception, but that's not what it means.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Mm-hmm. So that's efficacy. But now we move on to effectiveness. So this, once again from the WHO, is how your vaccine works in the real world.
Mm.
So effectiveness is measured by observing how well the vaccines work to protect communities as a whole.
Right, because I guess in a vaccine trial, it's near impossible to have, well, it is impossible to have a perfect representation of everyone.
Yeah, sampling is never perfect when you sample for a clinical trial. So when you're checking for effectiveness, a lot of these things are conducted through monitoring programs.
Right. And then you're also bound by the issues of what if something isn't reported? What if those numbers aren't accurate? Obviously, we strive to have the most accurate numbers as possible, but it is conceivable that some people who are sick don't ever seek medical treatment and it's not actually reported.
Neither are perfect, I guess, is what we're saying. But you can, I think, with a comparison of efficacy and effectiveness, you can get a sense of how well the vaccine is working.
Exactly.
Just like with your SPF or your hand sanitizer, the efficacy is kind of viewed as like, this is the best it will ever be. And the effectiveness is the actual protection that you're receiving because not everybody gets vaccinated, for example.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, so I think what's on everyone's minds is how effective are the COVID-19 vaccines?
Okay, so the CDC continuously monitors the COVID-19 vaccines. And actually, they publish a report almost weekly about these monitoring studies that they're doing. And I pulled a report from January 2022.
Okay.
There have been other reports. The reason I pulled this one is because this one was specifically looking at the vaccine effectiveness with 2 or 3 doses, and other reports, because this pandemic is developing, other monitoring also happens in like Delta and Omicron variants as well.
Okay, so what can we expect, I guess, in January 2022?
This report was titled Effectiveness of mRNA Vaccination in Preventing COVID-19 Associated Invasive Mechanical Ventilation and Death, United States, March 2021 to January 2022. And here they say that analysis of data on severe COVID-19 outcomes from a multi-state hospital network found that receipt of 2 or 3 doses of COVID-19 mRNA vaccine conferred 90% protection against COVID-19.
So your risk is 90% lower of getting COVID if you had 2 or 3 doses.
Yeah. And I think if you will recall, the efficacy was published a little bit higher at like 90 to 95% perhaps.
Yeah, 95% was the number that they kept saying. And I guess, too, if the 90% is an aggregate of those who received boosters and those who didn't, we have seen that that conveys more protection with the new variants. So that number could be a little bit higher for people who have 3 doses versus 2.
Exactly. Our situation is unique because it's still developing. New variants are still coming to light. And the vaccines were developed for, I guess, the initial or the original strain. And when we were looking at effectiveness against the new strains, they're not specifically targeted at those strains.
I think it all depends on what the virus changes. Because the virus is always working on its own fitness, like its own ability to go. And
yeah, like they're evolving much faster than we are.
Yeah.
I have a friend who's an epidemiologist, and she said that you can never determine whether you were prepared enough or not prepared enough until after everything is said and done. You can never say whether or not the decisions we're making now are the best until, like, I guess you have 20/20 vision or hindsight.
Or I guess in this case, 2022 vision.
I guess so. Yes.
How do we actually calculate vaccine effectiveness?
Okay. I am very glad you asked because you know I love a formula.
Oh, I know. I know you love formulas. Take it away.
So in this paper, they stated in their methods section that vaccine effectiveness is calculated or is equal to 100 multiplied by 1 minus the odds ratio. And we're going to talk about that. just as a definition of what is an odds ratio, the odds ratio represents the odds that an outcome will occur given a particular exposure. So in this case, the odds that you will get COVID-19 given that you got the vaccine compared to the odds of the outcome occurring in the absence of the exposure. So the odds of getting COVID-19 without the vaccine.
Right. So in this case, the exposure is the vaccine, which seems kind of, it comes down to like the technical language of research.
If your odds ratio is equal to 1, that means that exposure does not affect the odds of the outcome. So getting the vaccine does not affect whether or not you will get COVID-19. If your ratio is greater than 1, then the exposure is associated with higher odds of the outcome. So that means that getting the vaccine would actually increase your chances or your odds of getting COVID.
Thankfully, that's not what we're seeing.
Yes. And then finally, if your odds ratio is less than 1, that means that exposure associated with, in this case, the vaccine lowers the odds of your outcome. Lowers the odds of getting COVID-19.
Which is what we do see with the COVID-19 vaccines.
So I guess knowing now what an odds ratio is, if you go back to that formula, 1 minus the odds ratio.
Right. So the smaller the odds ratio, the greater your odds are of the exposure, the vaccine being protective, the greater the effectiveness.
Mm-hmm. So that's an overview of effectiveness and efficacy and how they compare.
And so efficacy is calculated as the relative risk. Is that correct?
Yes, efficacy is your relative risk. I have an actual formula, and this one I pulled from a JAMA article titled, "What Does 95% COVID-19 Vaccine Efficacy Really Mean?" And they give the formula as 100 multiplied by 1 minus the attack rate with the vaccine divided by the attack rate with the placebo.
Right. It's kind of along the same vein as the odds ratio.
Yeah, the formulas look almost identical, but in efficacy, your environment is very controlled. Like that's the clinical trial. That's what allows you to calculate it as like relative risk.
Yeah.
Because you've removed a lot of biases and outside influences.
You've controlled as many of the differences between the groups as you could.
We've chatted a little bit about how vaccines are developed. Now we know, hopefully, provided that we were adequate in our explanation, the difference between efficacy and effectiveness. I'm wondering if we can debunk some of like these common vaccine myths that we hear now that we have this knowledge.
I think we can. And
okay.
I think your training as a chemical engineer and my training in microbiology and medicine is going to help us kind of untangle and pull at these threads because there's quite a few common myths that you see. And I think it's important to counteract those with science and evidence.
Yeah. And I guess it's totally fine to be curious and to be cautious about vaccines and like medication in general, I think, because you are putting it in your body. But that's why we debunk myths or we talk about these things.
I think, too, misinformation spreads so easily online nowadays, and organizations or people who spread misinformation, it can look very legitimate. It can be really hard to tell fact versus fiction. So it's important to have reliable sources to look to answer those questions.
That's why I chose the WHO.
And a lot of my information comes from the CDC. Our first myth is mercury in vaccines.
Okay. So is mercury in vaccines?
Yes and no.
Okay. Is it like a compound of mercury?
Essentially. So we need to talk a bit about what mercury actually is because it sounds terrifying.
Yes.
So there's two main types of mercury. So there's methylmercury and there's ethylmercury. And methylmercury is extremely toxic. It can be toxic at low levels too.
That's the kind that you don't want in your drinking water.
And one thing to note too is that like mercury is naturally occurring.
Yes.
So if you're worried, it's not natural. But yeah, so methylmercury, that's toxic. That's the kind that can bioaccumulate in fish that we're very concerned about. We monitor.
Mm-hmm. And methylmercury is just like mercury with a CH3 group, right?
Yeah. one carbon molecule and 3 hydrogens. And then we have ethyl mercury, which is cleared from the body a lot more quickly than methyl mercury. So it doesn't, what we call kind of bioaccumulate.
Your body can process it. It can break it down and expel it from the body.
Exactly. So ethyl mercury has been added to some vaccines in the past and presently in some. We'll go through that.
I was going to ask you if it's a preservative, but I feel like you're about to tell me.
Yes, no, exactly. It is a preservative, and it's added to vaccines where they're multi-dose. So what that means is instead of having one vial with the exact dose for each vaccine, you might have 6 doses in a vial. There's other types of preservatives that can be added. So not every vaccine that's multi-dose has thimerosal in it.
Yeah, but that makes sense because like once you open up a vial of a vaccine, it's open to the air. You want to protect it from degrading.
Exactly, and prevent growth of bacteria. Of course, you try to maintain sterility as much as possible, but the principles of microbiology are essentially everything is everywhere all the time.
Yes. Conclusion, mercury is in vaccines, but it is the type that your body can break down and eliminate.
It's in some vaccines.
Okay.
So there's some myths about which vaccines it's in, actually. So the thing is, mercury is added to vaccines as thimerosal,
Okay.
which breaks down into ethyl mercury when it's in the human body, and then down to thiosalicylate, which is very readily eliminated from the body. It has never been in the MMR, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. It's never been in the chickenpox vaccine. It's never been in the inactivated polio vaccine, and it's never been in the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. So that's ones for pneumonia. The influenza vaccine, like our yearly flu shot, it's available in thimerosal containing and thimerosal free forms. So it just depends on what a place carries.
I see.
But the important part is that even if there is thimerosal in a vaccine, there's no harm. It does not stay in the body. It doesn't build up like mercury does in tuna.
Mm-hmm.
Data from many studies show no evidence of harm caused by the low doses. Research does not show any link between thimerosal in vaccines and autism. And the real kicker for me is, do you want to take a guess at how much mercury is in a can of tuna?
I'm trying to think. Is it on the scale of parts per million or parts per billion?
It's micrograms.
Oh, is it like 1 or 2 micrograms? I'm going to say less than 5.
Okay, so the amount of elemental mercury contained in a 3-ounce can of tuna fish is about 25 micrograms.
All right.
And then do you want to guess how much would be in a vaccine that does contain thimerosal?
Okay, I'm guessing that if it's in a vaccine, we're on like a much smaller scale, like parts per billion.
It's still micrograms, actually.
Oh, okay.
I know, I was surprised too.
If it's micrograms, I'm going to say less than 2 micrograms.
So it's the same. So, of course, it depends on the dose of the vaccine.
Yes.
But a vaccine with 0.01% thimerosal as a preservative contains 50 micrograms of thimerosal per 0.5 mils of a dose, which is a quite common dose, which works out to 25 micrograms of mercury in that dose, which is the same as a 3-ounce can of tuna fish. So if you would eat tuna fish, which we're worried more about methyl mercury, but are hesitant about the vaccine, you can rest assured that it is safe.
It's the same amount of mercury, but in the vaccine, you'll process it and it won't accumulate in your body.
Yeah. And the important thing to know, too, is we do all encounter methyl mercury in small amounts in life. It's out there. It's inevitable, but we try to avoid it. But we don't have to be as worried about ethyl mercury, and we don't have to worry about it in vaccines at the doses it's at now, especially because oftentimes the concern comes from there's mercury in vaccines, but they talk about vaccines that have never contained thimerosal or any other compound of mercury. So it's important to know because it's easy to feel concerned.
Yeah, and I feel like it's perfectly okay to ask your physician about these things and they can explain it to you as well. Like if you're getting a vaccine and you're concerned about the mercury, like ask, does this vaccine contain thimerosal? Like, and what are the effects of that? And your physician should be able to go through those risks with you at that time.
Exactly. And like that's why we have medical professionals and people who, train for years and decades to be able to answer those questions.
But I guess if you're going to ask a question, I would say be open to the response. And if you're still concerned, ask follow-up questions. But I would say go in open-minded. All right. I feel like we are going to talk about vaccines and autism because this is definitely a hot topic.
This is, yeah.
It would not be an episode about vaccines if we didn't talk about vaccines and autism.
Yeah. And really for this myth, we can thank a few people, but mostly we can thank Andrew Wakefield.
Dr. Andrew Wakefield or just Andrew Wakefield?
Well, he used to be Dr. Andrew Wakefield until his medical license was pulled.
All right.
So he was a surgeon in the UK, and in 1998, he published an article in The Lancet, which is a very prestigious and high-impact medical journal, which suggested that the MMR vaccine was increasing autism in British children.
So MMR is measles, mumps, rubella.
Yes, which does not contain thimerosal, nor has it ever. And there's a lot of problems with this paper.
Okay, break it down for me.
We talk a lot about what's a good paper, right? Like sample size, controls,
statistical significance.
Yes. So this was a case series, which means that there wasn't an intervention and a control group. It was a write-up of different cases, and there were 12 of them. So cases that shared some sort of similarity were chosen. Do you want to hazard a guess at what the sample size of this case series was?
I'm going to guess that it was small, because I think case series by nature are small. Certainly less than 50, perhaps less than 20.
You're right on the money. So it was 12.
All right.
Yeah. So it was very small. They had no control group. And what they were trying to link were 3 common conditions, like nonspecific colitis, developmental disorders in children, which is where autism comes into the arena, and then something called iliolymphoid nodular hyperplasia, which I'm not very familiar with. Basically, their conclusions were very speculative. And they had a lot of issues with the paper itself. So a lot of the data for each case relied on the parents' recall of what happened.
Self-reported data.
Yes. And oftentimes you go through the chart.
Yes, that's true. Like the medical records.
There's fallacies to memory.
Our recall is not accurate.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess that's interesting point number 1 in the procedure or the methods.
One thing that really is egregious is that they conducted all these investigations on the kids in the study without obtaining the necessary ethical approvals. So in order to do research, you need to have ethics approval, if applicable, right? If you're using publicly available data, it's often a different story, but especially with human and animal research, you need ethics approval before you touch anything or do anything.
Yes, it's very important, especially if you're doing something as serious as whether or not vaccines can cause autism, because the result of your experiments could be autism.
Exactly. And I think one of the things, too, is what's important to remember is just the fact that the study is a case series means it does not have the rigor and power to come anywhere close to saying anything about causation. You probably can't even get a correlation out of 12. It's so small.
It's a very small number, yes.
So they didn't have ethics approval. They falsified the data. There was a lot of cherry picking of the data.
So that means they pulled out the results that they thought proved their hypothesis while eliminating the results that they thought did not support the hypothesis?
Exactly. But even worse than that is the investigations after the fact found that they straight up falsified a lot of data. So just lied about what data they got. I think a question we all have is, why would someone do this? Because this goes against all the principles and ethics of science. So basically, Andrew Wakefield was funded by lawyers who had been hired by parents who were in lawsuits against vaccine-producing companies.
Oh, now I understand.
Yeah. So what resulted from this paper was it launched a ton of large-scale studies, which actually refuted any link between the MMR vaccine and autism.
So the results are not reproducible?
No, they aren't reproducible because they aren't real in a lot of cases. They're made up. And in 2004, 10 out of the 12 co-authors on the paper retracted their contributions. From 2003 to 2004, vaccination rates in the United Kingdom plummeted to 80%. And in 2008, measles was declared endemic in England and Wales.
An endemic means that it's circulating in the population.
Exactly. So it's circulating at a relatively constant level. And then if it shoots up from what we would expect as a constant baseline, given the parameters, that's when we talk about epidemic. And then if it's widespread across the world, pandemic.
Before that, I'm guessing we had largely considered measles to be eradicated. Well, I mean, it's not smallpox, which I think we do consider smallpox to be eradicated, but we did have sufficient vaccine coverage for measles.
Yeah, enough to keep it at bay. Measles was back, and it wasn't until 12 years later in February 2010 that the paper was actually retracted from the Lancet, which is a very long time to have this floating around in the literature with quite strong studies.
Yeah, quite strong studies refuting it.
Yes. Andrew Wakefield lost his medical license, and really, the result of it is widespread harm and distrust of vaccinations.
So in the papers that refute this conclusion, what makes them a stronger conclusion?
A lot of it comes down to study design. So studies had on the orders of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of data points.
So a much larger sample size.
The study design was more rigorous. So prospective and retrospective studies, ones that are cohort studies, so they follow a whole group over a period of time. It really comes down to study design, sample size, and research integrity. An example of one of these is there was a 2015 study in JAMA on autism spectrum disorder occurrence by MMR vaccine status in a very large sample. It was almost 100,000. It was just shy of 100,000 kids in the US who have older siblings with and without autism. So this study was a retrospective cohort study. So they had this cohort that was being followed over time, and they looked back to see what data had been collected on them. And what they found is that getting the MMR vaccine was not associated with an increased risk of autism spectrum disorder, regardless of whether the older sibling had autism. That's just one of many studies that are massive that found no association.
Final myth that we're going to bust is natural immunity versus vaccine immunity.
This is a hot topic, especially in COVID times, but we can really fall back on our ethical principles. So there's 4 kind of tenets of ethical principles in medicine. And the one that people are most familiar with, I think, is non-maleficence. So first, to do no harm. Basically, with every medical decision, we have to weigh the benefits and the risks and fall back on those ethical principles. One thing to keep in mind with natural immunity is natural doesn't mean safe. So poison ivy is natural, but we're not going to go frolic around in it. Snake venom is natural, but we're not going to go and get bit by a rattler intentionally.
Yeah, because it can still harm you.
Exactly. And the caveat with natural immunity is that it means you have to get the disease, which puts you at risk of whatever complications are associated with the disease. So in the case of COVID, it puts you at a higher risk of hospitalization and death. And those are pretty serious consequences. In order for vaccines to be licensed and available and approved, your chance of an adverse outcome from vaccines really needs to be a lot lower than from infection. And that's what we see with vaccines we have. And really, not every infection is great at activating the immune system and providing long-lasting immunity, whereas vaccines are specifically designed to produce a robust immune system and get those memory cells in our immune system that remember, what the invader looked like. So it varies because there's so many different bacteria and viruses that we encounter and have vaccines for. And, some natural immunity might actually be better, but the risks of the infection do not outweigh, the benefits of the vaccine.
Because, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but in order for a vaccine to come to market, you have to prove that it has low adverse risks.
Exactly. That takes us full circle to the development. And they're also monitoring, what are the antibody levels that we get with this vaccine? Sometimes, how does this compare to natural infection? And they need to show that the vaccine is good before it gets approved.
Mm-hmm. All right. Science seed time.
Yay!
All right. So it's time to plant our science seed. Each episode, we like to give our listeners something to think about, a science nugget to help you think more critically about the numbers, statistics, and really the science you hear every day. So, Lindsay, take it away.
Yes, our science seed for today is really just more of a general takeaway from our vaccine mini-series. So, the phrase vaccines cause autism became very popular, but I think a more apt phrase to describe and reflect the science behind vaccines and the lives that they've saved is that vaccines cause adults. We've seen massive reductions in childhood mortality from infectious disease because of vaccinations. And in areas of the world without widespread vaccine coverage and herd immunity, which we'll talk about next episode, we do see children dying of vaccine-preventable diseases. So getting your vaccines gives you and your child the best chance of reaching adulthood.
And I guess I should add that it's okay to have questions about vaccines. I would hope that if you have questions about a vaccine, you would ask your physicians because they have the training to answer those questions for you. Thanks for listening, everyone. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you find your podcasts. You can find the references we use for this episode in our show notes. A special thank you to Julian Bertino, who does our sound editing and music.
If you have a minute, leave us a review and rate us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It really helps our podcast reach new listeners. Have an idea of what number we should cover next? Want to learn more about what we talked about today? Follow us on Instagram at The Secret Life of Numbers.
We'll catch you next time on The Secret Life of Numbers, where the numbers can run,
but they can't hide.